The fog came in low and slow over the whispering sound, a patient animal with a white belly, curling around pilings and stone as if tasting the timbers and the mortar. Yara stood at the prow with the hood of her oilskin thrown back, hair braided tight, salt damp across her temples. The figurehead beneath her boots, carved blackwood that had once been a woman, and now was only teeth and a suggestion of a scream, parted the gray like a blade. Oars dipped without a sound. The men had wrapped the leather thongs with soaked cloth, and the cloth was soaked in oil, and the oil turned the creak of wood and sinew into a whisper. It had taken 2 days to teach them to do it by feel rather than by ear. 2 days of knuckles wrapped bloody on unyielding rails. Now they moved as if the silence itself were another oarman in the boat, keeping time, keeping faith. Ahead lay Oldtown. Ahead, the high tower, a pale finger pointing at gods who did not care. Somewhere high above the fog the beacon burned day and night, a steadfast sun for pilots and merchants and red wine fatties with bellies full of wine and mouths full of songs they would never sing again if she did her work right. She felt it before she saw it, a throb through the fog, the way the sea sometimes felt like a sleeping thing, and sometimes like a breathing one. There was a pulse to Oldtown as well, a heartbeat under stone. The river Honeywine brought it in and out. The tide fetched it. The ravens at the Citadel sent it out upon the air. Yara marked her breath to it, slow and steady, cold in her lungs. Another length, murmured Torvald close by her elbow, and she nodded without looking. Torvald's beard glittered with salt. His hands were scarred along the knuckles, in a line that spoke of casks cracked open, chests pried. He had a good eye for depths. He tapped the prow with his knuckles. 1, 2, 3. Signals passed down the keel, down the boat, down the line of boats, disappearing behind them into the gray. A shy wind came and turned the fog a darker color as if it could be dyed by breath. They had no singer in the black wind. Yara never allowed one. Song stole breath and gave nothing back but memory. And memory was a poor oar when the tide turned against you. Instead, she let thought fill the place where song would go. Thought of her father's long, narrow eyes, Balin Greyjoy staring at the mainland with a hatred that had fermented into vinegar. Thought of Euron's laughter when a knife found the meat between a man's ribs. That laughter lived behind her now as if a sail billowed in a wind of its own making. Thought of Theon as a boy trying to hold the knife like a man and cutting his thumb open for his trouble, his face too proud to weep. She cast the thoughts like lead to sound the depths of herself, and found them old and familiar and almost comforting. Anchors she could lift when she needed speed. Sounding, Torvald said. The lead line hissed over the side. A soft thunk, deep and sure. 4. Enough, Yara said. Bring her in. They had stolen a pilot out of a cove 3 leagues south at dusk the night before, bent him over a barrel, and poured brine into his nose until he wept and coughed chart names. The shoal that shifted like a sleeping hound beyond Battle Isle. The new rock that had fallen in winter from the Hightower's base and altered the eddy at the tip. The bar where the Mander and the Sound argued with each other and the tide decided which would win. He had tried to lie once. He had put a sandbar where it was not, and they had dragged him over the side and let him taste his own coast, blindfolded in the cold, until he learned that a boat's gentle roll was a language, and that Yara spoke it better than the men of Oldtown, with their sails like embroidered banners. Now, trust at the mast. He made a thin humming, and Yara did not know whether he hummed a prayer or an excuse. She did not care. The fog gave way by inches. A suggestion of bulk rose on their right, like a drowned fortress lifting its shoulders to breathe. The Hightower's outer wall. Below, at the base where the old black stones were oldest of all and slick with weed, the sea curled in a lazy green hiss. Further out, further up, a pale face of newer stone climbed into a sky the fog still owned, and the beacon above, hidden, but felt, painted the mist with a soft, unwavering brightness. The causeway that ran to Battle Isle was a rumor of lighter gray in the darker gray. There would be a watchman there, and another half-dozen at the gate at the island's foot, and more above. Hightower men with good steel and warden's pay, and mothers who would grow old in warm kitchens if Yara let them. She had no quarrel with the mothers, but she had business with the sons. Boats, said Torwald. There, and there. He kept his voice flat. In the fog, shapes made a fool of you. Better to talk like a man to whom shapes were only shapes until proven otherwise. Yara narrowed her eyes. The nearest shape was long and low, 2 masts furled tight, riding easy. A wine galley, red wine red under tar that turned it coal dark in the mist. The other, a harbor guard's barge, oars shipped, bumping softly against a chain of floats. We're earlier than their bell, she said. Good. The chain? Torwald flared his nostrils and lifted his chin. The floats bobbed, a long curve of dark shapes stitched together under the fog, drawn taut across the channel that led into the inner haven. The chain below them would be heavy, bar links thicker than a man's wrist, coated in weed and grease. It was raised at night and lowered when the harbor woke. The fog would have kept it up longer, but not forever. When the bell on the Hightower's lower levels tolled the harbor hour, when the pilots' guild hall finished their meat and onions, when the first red wine fatties grew impatient and demanded to be let out, then the chain would drop. She preferred to choose her hour herself. She had sent 6 men swimming earlier, naked as the sea birthed them, knives in their teeth and little bells of oil tied behind their scrota to warm them. They would be under the floats now, one by one, hands moving by feel along the grease, counting links, 1, 2, 3, until they found the padlocks holding the additional safety bars. The locks were iron, yes, but iron rusted, and men grew lazy about keys. A thin-wristed boy could work a simple hook into the old-fashioned weight and lever if he had learned patience shelling cockles. She had picked her swimmers herself from boys who had shivered on the piers of Lordsport and pinched clams by moonlight. Their mothers had taught them to wait for a tide. Yara had taught them to make one. She raised her hand. The oars lifted, held, and fell again in a slower rhythm, a sleepier one. The black wind idled like a predatory fish. Far behind, in the press of white, another hull groaned softly as a grapnel set on a barge. To her left, a second longship rubbed her flanks against a river wall so gently it might have been a lover's thigh. The world was all touch and breath now. Even voices were hands. The first bell tolled. It was deep and mellow, a good bell, the kind a city had to earn by building it in its bones and paying for it with taxes neither loved nor hated. It rolled across the fog in a slow wave and lapped at the side of the black wind. Then another bell answered it, thinner, higher, from a chapel on the far bank, then the more chaotic chime of a cluster of bells close together, an alley of sound, a neighborhood waking up. Oldtown stirred. The chain did not sink. Good, Yara breathed. Let them think the fog is charity. Let them think the day is theirs. A splash that was not a wave came from the floats, and a little bob of wood knocked itself against the hull. A hand appeared, gripped low. A breathing, shaking chest surfaced next. Then a boy's head slicked flat like an otter's. He hung there, teeth chattering, and Torwald reached down and took him by the scruff like a wet hound and heaved him aboard. The boy coughed up seawater and oil in 3 quick gouts, and smiled with a mouthful of blood where a lock had bitten him. 2, he gasped. 2 and 1 more, lady. The third sticks. Which side? Yara asked. The boy pointed with shaky certainty. She knew that certainty well. It was what a body felt when it had been a hair from dying but had not. A man could go a long way on that feeling. She rubbed his head once, brief as a knife kiss. Back to it. The boy nodded, teeth clacking, and slid over again with the seal-slick ease of someone born to short ladders and cold dawn. Yara looked past him. The Hightower's pale face was becoming a presence more than a shape. Fog thinned in curtains, torn slowly by a wind that had yet to decide whether it would declare itself. The harbor guard's barge ahead had 3 men on it huddled under their cloaks. One of them peered in their direction, saw only fog, and went back to his conversation. People trusted fog because the sea did. It was a mistake. Cask, Yara said, soft and ordinary, as if she meant the beer cask they had finished the night before. Torwald put a 2-fathom length of rope in her hand and a small cask in his other, no bigger than a child's head. She tied the rope like she had tied her braid, quick and sure, fingers knowing what they touched the moment they touched it. The cask went over, bobbed twice, and then moved under the surface at a polite angle. It would fetch up against the floats near the lock that stuck. If the boy could not open it, the cask could. Inside the cask was a shorter rope and a little willful flame in an oiled jar, and a promise. Wood and iron warmed became more accommodating than cold iron and wood. They waited while the bells told the city to rub sleep from its eyes, while a gull dropped out of the fog and hung in the black wind's lee, and considered whether Ironborn were edible, while the pilot at the mast hummed himself into a calmer fear. The sea slapped itself lazily against the high tower's black base. Once, a sound like laughter came down from above, warped and softened by fog, and every man who could hear made the sign for warding without thinking. Yara did not. The high tower was a place for tall stories, because tall stones wanted tall stories built into them. A lady at the top who peered into glass and saw other worlds, a lord who had walled himself up with books, candles that burned without fire and showed things far. Yara knew the stories. She had slept with men who told them in her hair. Stories were wind, useful if you had a sail and a destination, useless if you did not. She had both. The floats twitched, then eased. Torvald put his palm flat on the gunwale, reckoning the tension in the line like a farrier feeling the heat in a hoof. The curve slackened a little. It slackened a little more. It was not enough. Yara could have waited the quarter hour more until the men in the harbor guard's barge grew bored, until they took the float line and turned the wheel and the chain went down in a smooth, municipal way. But that quarter hour belonged to Oldtown. She wanted it for herself. Now, she said. The 3 boats behind the black wind came up on her flanks with a whisper. A second cask went over, and then a third, and then the longships leaned on the floats like beasts on a gate, gentle at first and then less so. A pop, a low groan, a metallic complaint like an old man getting to his knees. And then, beautiful, soft, profound, the sense in the water of something, heavy and committed, losing its grip. The chain sank. It did not drop. They had greased it well. It flowed down like an old woman laying herself into a bath, and the floats slid past one another with little private sighs, and then the water was open beyond. The harbor guard's barge swung a few degrees and bumped twice against a post. One of the men there started to lift his hand in a placating gesture at the fog, as if the fog were a mule, and never finished, for a grapnel took him in the midriff, and a second boat took the barge's rail with a hard kiss that tipped 2 more men into the sound. Yara did not watch them drown. Someone else would do that. There were always men who wanted to make sure of a kill. She kept her eyes ahead on the pale face of the high tower and the darker, more complicated face of the city beyond, where the river Honeywine wound like something golden under the fog, where roofs made little islands of slate and thatch, where the Citadel crouched like a sprawling beast with too many legs and too many chimneys. That was where the heartbeat lived. She was going to put her hand on it. When her oarsmen leaned, they leaned with their backs, and with their breath, and with everything else they had brought from the Iron Islands. Salt in their bones and time in their wrists, and the memory of mothers who had cut their hair with knives and told them not to cry because there were better uses for water. The black wind slid under the place where the chain had been, and for a bare second, every hand on the boat had the same wild thought. What if this is some trick? What if iron bites from below? But water is water. And it took them forward obediently. They came alongside the high tower's causeway like a cat, rubbing its flank against a man's leg in passing. Up above, a small door in the outer wall opened, and a man came out to piss. He pissed like a man secure in his place, facing the sea, turning his head slightly to see if any of his mates were watching, laughing at something someone said behind him, pissing enough to make a respectable noise. He turned back to the door, still rearranging his laces, and saw a ship where there had not been a ship. His face said the thing any good guard thinks at least once a day. How could I have missed that? And then an arrow came from somewhere to Yara's left and put a quarrel into his throat, and he died trying to figure out why the air had become so thick. Up, Yara said. Hooks bit stone, rope ladder bit palms. Torvald went first. He always did. He moved like a man who had read the grim obituary the world had written for him, and decided he did not care to accept its tone. 2 more men went after him with axes slung on their backs and knives in their teeth, then 3 with coils and grapnels. Yara gave the tiller to Karen with a look he understood. "Do not be clever, be stubborn." She slung her legs over the side and went up into fog that smelled like stone. The causeway was narrow, defensible, meant to be held by a handful against a handful. That morning it held 1 dying man and the signature of his death, bleeding water through the cracks between the stones. The door he had come out of was unbarred. Torvald put his shoulder to it, because a man who can open a door with his shoulder will always do so. The door gave. The passage beyond was tight and tilted and damp with a moss the color of old coins. They climbed. Somewhere above, the sound of the beacon changed and changed again in an animal way. A throat clearing. A growl. Yara could not see it and could not feel it except as a worry in her teeth. She had never minded a storm. A storm did not lie about what it was. A tower might. They came up into a little room with 3 slits for eyes and a brace of spears in a rack by the door. A man sat on a stool with his boots up, a roll in his hand and grease on his lip. He had time to look stupid, and then angry, and then afraid, and then an axe made the conversation shorter. Beyond, a stair spiraled upward around the tower's thick throat. The stone was worn hollow, where boots had chased each other century over century, a groove that would outlive them all. Torvald looked at Yara. Yara looked at the stair. They did not need words. She took 6 men with her. The rest went out along the causeway to meet the harbor they had to hold. If they did not hold it, nothing else mattered. Up and up. The spiral opened twice into rooms where men slept and ate and oiled leather. They left 2 bodies and 1 man whimpering under a table with a hand over his face, and Yara let him live because fear was a coin that spent itself in 2 directions, and she wanted both. From somewhere above came a rumble so deep it moved as much through the bones as through the ear, and then she saw it. A square of dull daylight that did not belong to the fog at all, a brightness that had nothing to do with sun or sky. The beacon's chamber. 2 men and a boy worked there, the boy turning the spit on which a huge wrought iron frame revolved, and the men tending the braziers and the bottle-thick lenses that focused the flame into a beam that could reach a ship 30 miles to sea. The room was hotter than the world outside could understand. Its walls sweat-sheened, its hearths a red mouth. Yara had seen furnaces and blacksmith sheds that felt less like a heartbeat than this did. The glass above the biggest brazier, the heart lens, caught the fire and bent it, and where the light passed through the fog outside, it changed the fog's color to a pale honey that had no origin in the sky. For a moment, she tasted grace. For a moment, she understood why men stayed at one place long enough to tell themselves it was theirs. Then Torvald knocked the boy sideways, and the beam of light wavered and smeared the fog like butter in a hot pan. One of the men grabbed a bar, one reached for a horn. Yara put her knife where a horn's call had not yet formed, and felt the horn in the man's breath stutter out under her fingers. The other had a stout stick to hand and swung it like a man who had swung it every day for 10 years. Torvald took it on a forearm, cursed, and a second man behind Yara stepped in and broke his stick with a blade. The room smelled suddenly and sharply of blood and brass. The boy coughed on his own spit, cried out once, and Yara spared him a look, measuring his age not in years but in wrists. 12, perhaps. 13, if his mother fed him well. She took the spit out of his hands before he burned, pointed to the corner, and he went there. He had some sense. "Do not let the light go dark," she told Torvald. "Make it less sure." Torvald grinned around 2 new purple lines swelling on his forearm. "Fickle as a woman, is that what you want?" "Fickle as the sea," she said. They turned the great frame slower, then faster, then stopped and turned it back, as if a careful hand somewhere far away could not decide how sure it wanted to be. The honey color out in the fog drifted, brightened, dimmed, sharpened to a knife for a heartbeat, and then melted back into a soft smear. On the water below, a pilot half blind and proud would say to himself, "That's odd," and then his mate would say, "Don't trouble yourself, Grig. It's only the fog," and Grig would feel his pride saved and go on. After a little while, The men of the city would say, "Someone should go up and scold the beaconsmen for their poor work." Later, they might say other things. "Boy," Yara said, and the boy flinched but came. He had eyes that had not learned yet to lie. Too open, too confiding. He was the sort of child Oldtown made more of than Pike did. "What's your name?" He swallowed, and Yara saw his throat move. "Salmon?" "Oh, salmon?" she said, trying the sound of it in her mouth. "When someone comes up here shouting, you will say there was smoke in the flue and you had to clear it and the hinge stuck. You will say men were sent to fetch pitch. You will say what will make them nod and curse and go down again? Can you do that?" He nodded too quickly. "Yes. If you lie badly, I will hear it from below, and I will throw your body from the tower, so your mother will say the sea killed you, and not a knife. If you lie well, you will see your mother again. Those are the choices. The sea is honest. Be like the sea." She did not raise her voice. The boy's lips worked. He nodded slowly this time, eyes damp, but not yet spilling. She had learned as a girl that crying had a time and a time not. The world had not been made kinder for having learned it, but it had been made clearer. From below came a ripple of sound like mice in grain. A rush, an encountering. "The harbor." "Down," Yara said. "We've cut their eyes. Time to cut their hands." They came out again onto the causeway into a world that had become 2 degrees brighter. The fog was lifting, not fleeing, only changing shape. It pulled itself into ropes and scarves and let the Hightower's base show like a belated revelation, black and old. Across the water, the city began to be itself. Roofs defined, alleys in the making, the thick back of the Citadel's main range like a cattle beast at cud. Bells stumbled into a rhythm. Over it, a high shrill came from somewhere. A boy sent to run and cry to someone, words racing ahead of feet. The black wind waited a boat length off the causeway with her oars shipped, and Karen's hand on the tiller like a sick man clutching a charm. Across from her, 2 other longships had made a little triangle with a 3rd iron-borne hull, and the harbor guard's barge jammed between them like a bone. 3 men in city green lay face down in the bottom of the barge. One was still alive. His heel twitched now and then, a fish on land. Yara lifted her chin, and Karen brought the black wind to the base of the causeway with an obedience that was close to love. "Citadel first," Yara said when she had her feet on her own deck again, and Torvald's grin changed so that it remembered caution. "The Hightower," he said. "There's glory in the Hightower. They'll talk of it for 50 years. There is talk in the Hightower," she said. "There is power in the Citadel." He lifted his shoulders in the little surrender that is the truest obedience. Not without thought, but after thought has found itself willing. "As you say, m'lady." She did not correct the title. When men used it, they meant 3 different things, and she took all of them. Respect, desire, fear. They would spend as coin. She pointed the black wind's blunt bow toward the stretch of city where long, low roofs crowded together, and little gardens made sober squares of green on the stone. A place without grandeur that had built it for others. The Citadel had a grace to it that the Hightower did not. It was not a single finger lifted to gods. It was hands, many of them, busy. On the river, the fog thinned first, as if the Honeywine had made peace with it, and they were not enemies after all, only 2 travelers in the same direction. Yara watched shoals which were not shoals rip themselves into being as the current pressed them against hidden stones, and she gave orders by finger and wrist more than by voice. She had the pilots trembling not because she needed it, but because she had learned never to throw away a tool. He croaked twice when sand where he thought water should be showed itself. Twice she adjusted before his mouth could catch up to his mind. He hummed again after that. Humbled by competency, she did not smile. They slid under a stone bridge with moss in its joints and an old man's lichen eyebrows. A woman above, crossing with baskets, paused for a just long enough heartbeat to frown into the fog at shapes that were not the shapes she saw every day. Then she went on. Bread would not bake itself, and children did not feed themselves a morning meal. The men on the banks began to notice. Men in green livery and men in no livery at all. A pair of boys with slings stopped slinging and stared. Someone on a balcony shouted a question, and someone below answered one. Neither question nor answer traveling far. Bells were suddenly not enough. A trumpet blew. A city trumpet with too much duty and too little breath. It sounded defiant for 3 notes, and then consoled itself. The Citadel came down to the river like a guilty man coming to the edge of a crowd. Close enough to hear what was said, not so close that he could be accused of having said it. Its walls were not high to threaten, but thick to outlast. What it had laid against the river was practical. Landing stairs, wide and shallow, so that carts could be carried up one stair at a time and then another by men who knew how to lift in their legs and not their backs. A stone ramp, a door as wide as a vineyard cart. Above that, beyond, the cluster and swarm of roofs and chimneys. Beyond that again, the towers with the colors of the archmaesters beaten into their weathercocks. Green and silver and black and the rest. A rainbow that had seen better die. Yara felt the same odd grace she had felt in the beacon room. But this grace was of steadiness rather than command. 1,000 hands doing small things in the same direction day after day until a city could depend upon it. She had picked this landing because she had a friend in the Citadel. Friend was not the right word. Instrument, perhaps. A novice with a neat hand who had once been very susceptible to flattery and then had learned to be susceptible to coin. He had sent her copies of tide books in little packets, stitched into the lining of fish heads. He had sent her a map of the honey wine, annotated in a careful script with notes like "Beware here in winter," and "Do not tempt this shoal in the night of a new moon." He had sent her a drawing of the Citadel's ravenry with the numbers of cages and a discreet X where the chain for the trapdoor was secured. He had never sent her his name. He did not need to. Yara had met his kind many times. Men who wanted to be brave, but had chosen safety early. Men who wanted to be dangerous, but had promised their mothers. He would not be brave when bravery meant fear for him. He would be brave when it meant something slight, barely a risk at all. She had planned for that. The landing stairs were empty in a way that was not natural. Empty in a way that spoke of messages sent and understood. Yara recognized a trap and appreciated it. She had brought one for them as well. She had 6 men leap ashore along the left-hand stair and 9 along the right. They spread like the wet shadow of a gull's wings on stone, and then pulled in again, and in the moment of that movement, a flight of crossbow bolts harped toward them from window slits. The Ironborn had their shields up all as one, without a shouted order, not because they were disciplined like mainland soldiers were disciplined, but because they were disciplined like men on a boat were disciplined, used to the way an order had to live in the body before it could live in the ear. 9 bolts clattered against oak, and 3 found the stone, and 1 went thunk into a shoulder, and the man said, "Huh," as if surprised, and kept moving. Yara threw a smoke pouch at the window that had shot last. It burst into a soot that tasted of pepper and something else. A man coughed. A bowstring twanged badly. A bolt went nowhere. Her men were already at the door with axes. Good axes. The sort of axes Ironborn bought with grief and used with love. The door gave after a short, disinterested argument. A pair of men in soft robes stood beyond it, as if they had been put there by a playwright with poor taste. One had a chain around his neck and a face like cured pork. One had only the robe, and upon him the robe had an air of injury, as if he had wrestled it and lost. "No," said the chained one on principle. "You must not." "I must," Yara said flatly, and stepped aside so that the men with her could secure the hall without breaking too many things, which was a skill of its own. The stone-flagged floor, and the drafts, and the smell told her she was in some back part of the thoroughfares, one of the larders that fed the apparatus of knowledge. Men in gray scurried like mice, refusing to see until seeing could not be refused, then seeing too much. One boy went to run, and Torwald caught him by the scruff, so that his little legs ran in the air for a moment, like a beetle tipped over, and then stopped. Yara lifted a hand, and the Ironborn settled into a readiness that was like the moment between one wave and the next. "I come to parley," she said. The man with the chain reared back a little. indignant because indignation was how he had learned to defend himself when reason did not work. His chain was made of many metals. Yara had listened by many firesides to stories about what each link meant, how each metal was earned by mastering some learning, and found the stories too simple for the men who wore the chains she had met in taverns and courts. Men earned their metals by memorizing, and memory did not keep a ship off a rock. He had white hair, this man, and skin like paper stretched over something dry. "You come to steal," he said. "I come to take," she said. Stealing is something men shame one another with when they happen to be on the losing side. "You will be on the losing side," he said. "The Hightowers." "Do not give me their names," Yara said, amused and bored at once. "I know them." Leighton in his tower. Baylor and his sons in their guardrooms pretending that swords swung by others are somehow hung from their own belts. "I know the Redwynes too. And the men of the Arbor. The winds held them last week. I asked them to." She let the lie stand in the room a moment like a gust, and the men who did not have chains believed it, because men always believe that the sea belongs to those who handle it without apology. The chained man did not believe. His mouth tightened, then relaxed. He was not brave and he was not a fool. "I am Archmaester Peristan," he said, and Yara nodded to herself. She had read a treatise by that name, about the lineages of kings, with such love of footnote, that the kings had become second to the notes. "Good," she said. "I have read your book." His eyes darted around her face with a quick greed that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with wanting to be remembered for the right reasons. "And your, thoughts. You have a beautiful hand," she said. "Your sense of inheritance would wreck a boat if you tried to pack it in the hold and ship it across a narrow sea." Torvald made a strangled sound behind her that might have been a laugh if he'd been anyone else. The Archmaester's face did something unfortunate and comic. Then he gathered his chain close, as if it could be a shield. "You cannot simply walk into the Citadel," he said. And then he realized too late that he had said it to a woman who was in the act of doing exactly that. Yara liked him better for the realization. There were men who never noticed when the world disobeyed them. "What do you?" His voice trailed off. He could not quite bring himself to say want, as if wanting were a thing he was not quite dignified enough to own in another. "Your ravens," Yara said. "Your keys. The black door. The room beyond it. Your better maps. Your star books with the little ink stains at the edges where apprentices have spilled because they were too tired to remember not to. Your records of flood and drought, the years when ships grounded a yard further from shore than other years. Your lists of pilots. Your ciphers and their counter-ciphers. The names of those who served here who went away to serve lords, and might still be moved by a word from their first house. 10 men with quick hands and clear heads who can read the sea in a book better than the men of the Arbor can read it with their noses. Your glass candle." She watched the last strike him like a slap. His mouth opened, closed. The men in the gray behind him looked at her with a new attention that had less to do with fear and more to do with curiosity. "There is no," he began, automatically, falling into the Citadel's old habit of denying the mysterious the dignity of existence until it either lay down before them or climbed over them indifferent. "Do not," Yara said quite gently. "Do not make me bored by forcing me to say the words all men say before they let a door open. I know otherwise. I do know otherwise. I know that your candle burns, Peristan. I know who lit it. I could use the candle, or I could break it. I am not sentimental. Or I could break it." A small cough came from the hallway beyond the Archmaester. It was not the cough of a man concealing himself. It was the cough of a cat who had decided to stroll into a yard where fighting dogs wrestled because cats did not think in dog. The man who came forward was spare and brown and dressed like any other maester, but his chain was not like any other chain. The metals were the same. The weight was different. He had eyes that refused to pretend that the room was not what it was. A place where a woman in sea leathers could choose to kill him and choose instead to make his day more interesting. "Marin," Peristan said, scowling deeper. The name fit him with a rough familiarity like a jacket that had been rolled under a head as a pillow. "One too many nights. You will not help this." I am reader enough to know a tide when I see one, the other said. He tilted his head at Yara. Captain. Marwyn the Mage, Yara said. They call you that. He shrugged. A small movement. They call me many things. Mage is one of the kinder. I do not care what you are called if you are useful. Ah. Already his face had the look men get when they smell their own amusement coming nearer. Usefulness is a virtue the Citadel does not prize. They prefer words like continuity and safekeeping. He stepped around Peristan and ran an eye over Torwald's bandage with a brisk sympathy, as if it was a problem to be solved, rather than a wound to be admired. You are here to plunder, he said to Yara in a tone that made plunder sound like a subject at lecture. I am here to take what I can hold and not to be ashamed of it, she said. Today I can hold this place. That is more than I can say for many men. Ben? Many men cannot hold their wives' attention long enough to get a cup of beer, Marwyn said without malice. And Yara decided to like him until he made that impossible. The glass candle burns, yes. You cannot use it. It would use you. I, on the other hand, can look through it and see what I wish to see, or what wishes to be seen. His eyes flicked to Peristan with a small malicious delight, like a boy who had found a grown man's private weakness and prodded it with a stick. You might prefer the ravens. They are honest. When they lie, it is because someone has taught them to. Nender. Keys, Yara said, turning a little so that her men could feel her turn more than see it, so that they shifted in a way that shifted the entire hall's mood. Peristan. Do you have them? I do, he said, hating his mouth for being ahead of his mind. But I cannot simply. You can, Yara said. You cannot simply do many things. This is not one of them. He lifted a hand that told the boys behind him to bring forward the ring of iron that made a music of its own when moved. Yara took it in her palm and liked its chill. She had always liked the difference between iron and sky, one you could hold on to. She handed the ring on to Torwald, who plunged it into his belt, like a man kissing a girl at a fair. Peristan flinched a little when the noise of the keys went away from him. Habit had attached his hand to them without his knowing it. The ravens, Yara said. Marwyn, do not go far. I have no intention, he said cheerfully. For once the morning looks instructive. They climbed. Peristan hated stairs. He hated the way his breath demonstrated that he was mortal. Yara watched him with the faint interest she afforded to a crow that hopped alongside a ship in a calm. The Ravenry was a long, low space with a wall of open windows facing the river, all of them barred, and all of them smeared with the long history of bird. The air was salt and shit and feather. The birds looked at them and said interesting things, bits of message learned and not understood, for the hand. One croaked into the fog as if an invisible king were standing outside in a boat. Mager, mager, rar, said another who had taken some history lesson too much to heart. It always amazed Yara that men had the patience for this, to make a beast mimic a word, to teach it to deliver the sound across miles and then forget it. She admired the stubbornness of it. She did not admire the faith. Peristan had to count, and he counted with his fingers, twice, and then again. The gray-robed boys made little adjustments around him, terrified of being in the way, and equally terrified of not anticipating a need. He lifted the right key and found the right lock, and lifted it before he could change his mind. The door to the far bells opened with a soft scold of old hinges and a deeper rush of smell and sound. A black tide of feather and eye shifted within. Messages waited to be sent. Messages where an ocean men could drown in as well as the one Yara loved. She lifted her hand and the boys looked at her as if it might be a benediction or a blow. Then she spoke the names of the lords she had learned over years of wine and war. Hightower first, red wine next, then Tyrell, and told the maesters around her what to say to them in their own ciphers and plain besides. To the Hightowers, the harbor is untroubled. The fog plays tricks with the light. Remain at comfort. Do not alarm the city. To the red wines, there is no need to run your ships from the Mander. The fog will lift by noon as the wind shifts. Wait for word of wine price from the guild. To the Tyrell stewards in Highgarden, Oldtown slumbers. All is stable. There is a dispute between two guilds about barrel sizes that requires mediation. Send no riders, send no soldiers. The roads near the river are soft with last week's rain. Peristan stared at her mouth as if it were a mathematics being spoken. The boys wrote in a speed that impressed Yara because it was the speed of necessity, not of fear. The words went into the tubes, into the scrolls, into the leather. The birds took their burden like patient little ships, their legs skittering as they hopped to the braces. For a moment she had an urge to apologize to them, to say something like, "I will be kind as I can." Then she let the urge go. The sea was not kind. It was itself, and that was enough. Torvald stood with his back to the door, listening to the hall beyond and the world beyond the hall, counting distances by the way sound came through them. "They will send men," he said, almost lazily, which meant he was not yet afraid. "The Hightowers are not fools." "I know," Yara said. "We will meet them where the halls narrow." Peristan made a little distressed sound. "This is a place of learning. This is a place like any other," Yara said. "Built by men who wanted to keep what they had and take more. Do not pretend it is something better. The pretenses of the Reach have made them gracious in their own eyes. It is a charm that will not turn a blade." She pointed at the ravens, now a scrabble as the boys settled the last of them into the open. "Send them. If any of those men are as clever as you believe them, they will read those words with the right kind of doubt and keep their roofs." Peristan hesitated. Marwyn smiled. Slow and sulky. "Do as she says," he said amiably. "If she has more sense about soldiers than you do, and she does, she may have more sense about light as well." Peristan's chin set. He nodded to the boys. Ropes were pulled. The birds went. They went into fog that now was not fog, but 1,000 scarves tattered by the sun. They went with faith or without it. That was not their business. The room grew quieter by several measures Yara had not known she was hearing until they ceased. "You wanted the black door," Marwyn said. "You will show her the black door," he told Peristan with the air of a man who had no patience for another man's reluctance to deal with the part of his own house that leaked. Peristan clutched his chain. "The black door is not. It is precisely what she thinks," Marwyn said, calm as a man discussing stew. "You will show her, or she will break your lock and the door both." The black door was less dramatic than the name suggested. It was a door set in a wall in a part of the Citadel, where walls had learned to be patient. It was not iron, no show of strength, but dense oak stained with smoke and age. Its hinges were unbeatable only in the sense that they had never learned to surrender. The key went, as keys do when their holes have known only a few hands. The smell inside was odd and intimate. The perfume of old paper and old leather and salvage, and under it, a sharpness like flint struck together. They stepped into a dim, whose corners did not so much hide themselves as decide to be private. Yara liked it. Shelves made of old wood turned to old bone by the years held jars and books and little things set carefully on little pads of cloth. Care had been here longer than any of them. Marwyn went ahead without asking permission because a man like him did not ask for permission in his own house, no matter who had put a knife into whose neck that morning. He went to a table that had a pad on it and lifted a cloth. The glass candle lay beneath, not unlike a bar of jet, not unlike a carved thing from the finger of a dead king, not unlike a weapon. It did not burn now, being day. That was superstition, and Yara had come too far with her mother's knife in her boot to believe it, but she let herself enjoy the convention. Night would make it live. Or will. Marwyn's. She reached out. She could not help it. To put her palm just above its length and feel, not heat, but the suggestion of a chill that had deepened into something purposeful. It learned to burn again after centuries, Marwyn said softly, as if to a woman he slept beside. When dragons were born into the world again. Or when men learned to look at one another through a different glass. It is difficult to know the beginning of a thing. It is easier to know what it becomes. What do you want of it? Openings, Yara said. The world has doors. I want to see which will open when I lean hard. "Ben T. And you think the candle will show you?" "I think it will show me men," she said. "And men are the doorways to most things. Make it burn." Peristan made a sound that could have been prayer or protest. Marwyn ignored him. He set his hands on either side of the candle and lowered his head like a man at a winter hearth anticipating warmth. Yara watched with the interest she gave to a knot. How it was tied, how it was undone. The air around the candle felt different, as if a draft had found a way into a sealed room. The candle did not catch fire. It acquired brightness, a way of owning light that had nothing to do with flame. It was not much like the Hightower's sure beam. It was like something colder deciding to be generous for a moment. The glass became visible in the way the sea becomes visible at night, when a fish disturbs it, and the tiny luminous creatures in it answer. Peristan whispered an old word. Marwyn did not. He leaned in, and the light leaned as if a breath on the other side had fogged the glass. "Seeing with this," he said in a voice that was already partly elsewhere, "is like reading a letter that wants to be read by someone else. But sometimes, it allows a stranger in the room." He lifted his eyes, and they were not exactly his eyes for a second. "Do you have a name in your mouth?" Yara had many names in her mouth. Some she spit, some she swallowed. She chose one, and did not say it aloud. She let it sit behind her teeth like a bit. She thought of Baelor Hightower's second son. A boy with too much hair and not enough patience, who liked to listen at doors when he was drunk, and had a way of taking his knife out of its sheath and putting it back in just to hear the sound. She thought of him because he might be useful, because men like that betray something before they have learned which way to betray. She let his face form in her mind the way a coast forms out of fog, cautious, then unabashed. Marwyn's mouth twitched. "Ah," he said. "Then look." He moved aside one handbreadth. Yara stepped forward. The candle's light was not light in any honest sense. It was a suggestion of the way looking can become seeing when it stops insisting on sight. The room fell away a little, and then a shape, not fully a shape, was there in front of her. Someone's shoulder, the thought of a door, a man's laugh that sounded like it belonged in a court and a stable both. Then the feel came of moving along a corridor where tapestries had been assigned to hide drafts and ended up hiding other things. And the taste in her mouth that had been rope and salt and iron became sweeter, like wine spilled and stepped in. She pulled back involuntarily as if a wave had found her when she had not braced properly. Torwald's hand steadied her elbow and left it, embarrassed. The light in the glass did not change, because it was not light. It was a way of saying yes to sight. "There," Marwyn murmured, pleased with himself as only the useful are. "You have a door." The door in the vision opened. A young man stood in the gap with a grin that did not improve his face. Baelor's second son, yes. He was speaking to someone Yara could not see, his hands moving as if the words had been carved into them first, and his mouth only followed. She did not have time to decide whether she liked him as a tool, because the vision shifted, skittish, and became something else. A hand at a desk. A bit of scar on the back of the hand that said, once, a dog, a seal, a piece of paper folded and folded again. Not enough. She leaned in, and the candle cooled her breath. She pulled back and it warmed. She had the sensation of a thing reluctant to allow a trespasser. She did not ask for more. She had learned as a girl when to ask and when to stop. "Enough," she said, and stepped back. "This is clever," she told Marwyn. "I do not trust cleverness unless it belongs to me." Marwyn made a pleased little bow. "Prudent, Dot. We will take the ravens," Yara said. "Unbar 2 cages that are not supposed to be unbarred, and men will notice too late. We will send the messages I have said, and the other messages I have not. We will take your tide books and your charts. Peristan can choose 10 men who will come with me until I decide which are the best 10, and send the others back with their skins and their pride. We will leave enough of you for the city to find useful. I do not want to break the Citadel. A broken tool is good for nothing except being pointed at and blamed when the work does not get done. Shh. You are unlike most killers I've read," Peristan said weakly. "I am unlike most men you have read," Yara said, and the brief, thin pleasure she took in saying it warmed her in places the candle could not. Torwald. The door. We will not linger. Nah. They lingered just long enough to set their pattern. When the Hightower men came, as they must, they came up stairways that had been greased at one step in three, so that boots trusted themselves wrongly and bodies fell not far but badly. And at the first landing each man found a rope strung at the height of a knee, invisible if one looked too high and bruisingly real if one did not. And beyond that, an empty corridor that offered no obvious enemy, and a concealed archer of fair nook. Those first men went down the steps again carrying others and shouting lies in a way that pleased Yara. Men lie best when they lie to themselves out of kindness. On the river, the fog had gone beyond pretending to be fog, and was becoming the kind of dew that gives a morning a smell that says it will be warm later. The Black Wind and her sisters held the landing with a belligerent ease that brought out the worst in men who thought of water as a thing you poured and not a thing you fought. A handful of city lads thought to be heroes and found they were not. A man in green with a scar on his chin and love for his work met Torwald's axe and loved it for 3 heartbeats, and then learned that love can be fatal. The bells made a new music now, one with urgency in it, and in it, to Yara's ear, something else. Calculation. The city was deciding what it would be to her. It had a right to choose. She had a right to take the choice away if they chose wrong. In the Citadel, boys with chains that were not yet chains carried out bundles of parchment and leather and smelt like fear and tallow and ink. Men with chains that were too heavy turned circles like tethered goats, unable to decide where panic ought to sit on their necks. Marwyn moved in and out of them like a man in a bathhouse stepping around the hot water boys, smiling to himself at the way the world was finally interesting. Peristan discovered he had more courage than he had guessed he had when his fingers went to the old black iron of a lock and turned it in defiance of something inside himself that said never. And again found he had less when a boy dropped a jar and it cracked, and the smell made the room seem suddenly flammable. Yara watched them all and did not waste pity on any of them. Pity was a coin to keep, not spend, if you wanted to build a kingdom with it. They found the room she had hoped to find. She would have found it if she had had to tear down a wall to do it. A place where the Citadel kept its records of tides and floods and strange years. The script was careful, the hand precise, the little notes in the margins the best part. A man with a clerk's soul putting himself on paper in the small comments he allowed himself when he thought no one would ever read them. Beware here in summer, he had written in one. The river goes treacherous, like a man in love. She took that book first, because even enemies deserve respect when they are sudden poets without meaning to be. She took the charts she could understand, and the charts she could learn to understand, and the charts she could not understand, but that smelled like usefulness. She took a bundled star map twice repaired with the careful love of a man who had no child, and needed some other thing to be tender to. She took fewer books than Torwald thought she should take, because Torwald believed all weight became equal once it was aboard ship, and she knew that sometimes weight became an anchor you could not cut loose. It was close to noon when the first true wind of day finally put its hand out into the harbor and moved the remaining scarves of fog into corners and under stairs. It climbed up the high tower and made the beacon's light look less godly and more man-made. The city showed itself like a proud woman waking and taking off her night shift with a certain casual arrogance. From the high tower's lower platforms, men with horns began to blow in a way that meant decision had been made, and a certain sort of courage had been gathered like a thrown cloak. On the near side of the river, over a thick wall draped with vines, high tower men in green and white showed their banners where street met square. On the far side, sons of merchants who owned barrels but not blades picked up spears that had been their grandfathers and tried on their hands like borrowed gloves. On the river, a dozen small boats with hooks and long oars and expressions of intention arranged themselves, ungainly and brave. "Here they come," Torwald said, in the careful, cheerful way men say when a brawl will at last make their day make sense. "Hold them," Yara said. "Do not eat them. We are not sharks. We are fishermen. Let some through, so that they can tell their wives a story tonight that will make the city brave in the way I prefer." Then see. What way do you prefer? The kind that requires a treaty by week's end? She said, and he made a face he would have made at a soft cheese brought to table where salted beef should have been. She clapped his shoulder because he was honest. Then she went back into the Citadel, because there was one more thing she wanted before she gave the day back to the city. Bruised and altered, but alive, she found the novice she had bought without ever seeing. She knew him by his hands. He had the careful, narrow nails of a man who had scratched at too much parchment, and not enough skin. He held himself like a man who had been pleased to be useful to someone who was dangerous until the day the danger came to collect its due, and then decided that perhaps usefulness had limits. He looked at her and did not pretend to mistake what she was, and she valued that. "You will go with me," she said. He licked his lips, which were chapped from winter air and worry. "Where? Where you are useful," she said. "On a ship, perhaps. In a town I mean to hold that does not know yet that it belongs to me. In a tower where we will read the wind and send birds and make men across the sea do what we want, because they think they chose it." Then a traitor. He hesitated. She had expected him to. She had had a mother teach her how long to let a boy hesitate before you either slapped him or took his chin in your hand and lifted his face to yours. She did neither, because he was not hers yet. He was the Citadel's. He smelled like it. Ink and old cloth, and a little bit like pie when pie has been made by a woman too tired to care whether the crust flakes. She let him make the choice, because choices made by the man who pays never last as long as those made by the man who must live with them. "Yes," he said at last, surprising himself, and then was brave enough to smile at his surprise. "Yes, I will go." "Good," she said. "What is your name?" "Renifer," he said, embarrassed by it. "Ren," she said. "It is what you will be called aboard regardless of your mother's work at the christening. If you are clever, you will answer to it without making a face." "Nanny," he smiled because her scorn had not been unkind, and because he felt he had been admitted to a thing that had rules and he could learn them. "Yes." She took him to the black door again. Peristan wrung his hands in a habit so deep it had worn grooves in his fingers. Marwyn looked into the candle once more and did not share what he saw. Because men like Marwyn fed on secrets in a way that made them survive where other men died. Yara put her hand on the candle's table and felt the wood under the cloth, the old, well-made bones of it. She thought of her mother's hands making a braid, of the rough, homely beauty of that competence. She thought of braids and ropes and charts and chains, and all the things that bound men to one another, whether they wanted to be bound or not. She wondered whether the candle might show her a way to tie a knot between her islands and this city that would not be broken by swords. "You have taken much," Peristan said, with a last attempt at a certain dignity. "You have taken too much." "I have taken enough," Yara said. "Enough to make the next taking unnecessary." Outside, the day had decided itself. Sun moved over stone and made roofs blink. The river shrugged off the last of the fog like a cloak, and showed her a color that belonged to spring more than to war. The black wind rode the current with stubborn ease. Men discovered they were not heroes and were not cowards, which is where most men live. A gull landed on the Hightower's causeway, where unseen men wiped up blood with buckets and curses. The city's heartbeat had altered, but it beat. Yara felt it in her ribs, as if she had swallowed a small drum. "Lady," Torwald said at her shoulder, respectful, impatient, honest. "They ask whether we hold the day, or whether we spend it." "We bank it," she said. "We will need it later." He nodded as men nodded to her when they had agreed to obey, even if they did not fully understand. She went down the stairs with a rustle of leather and the ring of keys she had stolen as a counterpoint to the chains she despised. Boys ran past her with messages in their hands and solemnity in their faces. Men passed her with their own chains clinking, contempt in their eyes, and then, a heartbeat later, calculation. The city watched her from windows with veiled women and unveiled hopes, and the sad, amused tolerance older cities have for those who think they could possibly change them. She did not intend to change Oldtown. She intended to add herself to the list of names it had to say when it bragged to strangers. On the landing, the black wind took her as if she were the only cargo that mattered. Ren stood awkwardly on her deck trying to learn where to put his hands, where they would neither offend nor endanger. Torvald put him at the bow with a rope in his hands, and a task that had little weight and much meaning. Karen canted the sail, and the ship moved into the honey light. And for a moment, Yara saw at the corner of her eye the beacon's beam go thin, and then fat, and then steady. The boy salmon up there would be making a story of hinges and smoke, and a man would be deciding to be angry, and then deciding he had better things to do, because there was stew to be eaten and wives to be obeyed. Good. Oldtown needed to be itself for a few hours longer. Where to now? Torvald asked. To the market where the pilots eat, she said. To the hall where charts are bought and sold by men who pretend they do not pray. To the little houses where men who once served the Citadel live with wives who know they will always be half married to books. She looked at Oldtown with the appraising lust of a woman who had already had a thing once and was deciding how she would have it again. And then to the steps of the starry sept, she said, just long enough to tell the gods that if they have any sense, they will not get in my way. Torvald made another face. They will not like that. The gods like many things, she said, slipping the knife back into her boot so that it kissed her ankle. They like to be feared. They like to be flattered. They like to be ignored if they have had enough of men. I will let them choose. Then I will do what I came for, which is to take the day and store it. And after that, we will see. Bendo. They did not march into Oldtown like conquerors. They moved like a new current going up a familiar river, unnoticed by the stones and noticed by the boatmen, who felt the difference in the way their poles leaned, and their backs did not understand why. In the pilot's hull, men who had stared at fog since they were 12, and learned to love and hate it in equal measure, pretended they did not see Torvald's bandage, and did see the coin Yara put down for a plate of stew. She did not eat, and a cup of wine she did not drink. She asked questions of no one and everyone. About the sandbars that came and went. About the wind on days when the hills were green. About a time a man remembered when a ship had been there and then not. She negotiated a price for a tide book in which the useful margin notes were not erased, and for a chart that had been mended across a crease so often it had learned to fold itself that way forever. She smiled at a woman behind the counter, whose hands had the scars bakers have, and the gentleness sailors love. She let the room decide whether she had brought fear or work or both. By the end of an hour, the pilots had decided that it was work. They would tell that to their wives. The wives would decide whether they were liars. Outside, the river's smell changed because it was noon, because the sun had warmed things that had not been warm at dawn, because a fishmonger had shoved a barrel of off-fish into a corner, and hope had made a truce with sting. Ren looked at everything with the hungry solemnity of a man who knows he is leaving, and wants to take pictures in his head that will never fade. Yara watched him to see whether his hunger would turn poisonous. She had learned over and over that men who loved knowledge beyond reason would cut throats more cheerfully than men who love steel. He looked like a boy who, if he cut, would do it under a law of his own. She could use that. The bells changed again in the second hour after noon. This time there was a language in them Yara had heard in other cities on other days. A language that meant men whose rooms were high and whose bellies full had decided whether to fight now or later. The Hightowers, green and white, came down the street with a roll of drums that pretended they had never retreated in their lives. They did not come to the Citadel's door. They came to the edge of the square and stopped there as if the square were a pool and they could not swim. Baylor Hightower himself did not show. His second son did not show. A captain with a pin on his breast in the shape of a tower stood forward and spoke down the square as if it were a road and his words a cart. You violate the Citadel, he said. I visit it, Yara said. The square carried her voice back to her with a kind efficiency. And it has been polite. He swallowed a thing that wanted to come up. It was not fear. It was the misery of a man who had expected to be obeyed and found that the day was sullen. You will leave. She shook her head with courtesy. We will go when we have finished. You are not welcome. She lifted a hand to the rooms behind her, To the men with chains deciding which kind of dignity would survive this day. That is not what your scholars have said, and it is their place to say it. Tell your lord, we will speak to him this evening at the 6th bell. The gods will be fed by then, and so will we. If he will not come to the square, we will meet on the causeway at the base of his tower. If he will not meet there, we will meet on the river with ships between us. If he will not agree even to that, we will send ravens and make treaties without the grace of faces. She let the last words sit on the stone like a weight. Do not mistake me. I prefer faces. But I have learned to live without what I prefer. The captain stood there longer than he should have, making a study of how a woman could refuse him without making a show of it. Men learned slowly, and then very quickly, when humiliation threatened. He bowed a little because he was not a fool, and because he would tell himself later that refusal dressed in courtesy could be called respect. Then he went away with his men marching like a drumline of pride with a bruise under the skin. Marwyn came to the square and stood beside Yara like a friend in a play who does not have lines in this scene, and will have many in the next. You will make a treaty, he said, mouth tucked into his beard like a conspirator's. I will make a thing that looks like one, she said. I will make Oldtown pretend it lost nothing today, so that it can admit to itself tomorrow that it has to do as I ask. And the Hightower. They will say I dishonored them. They will decide whether their honor costs them more men and coin than I cost them. They will decide whether their honor is a thing they can show off without paying interest. The Redwynes will send letters asking whether their barrels will move. The Tyrells will say nothing and take notes. The Citadel will change only in parts it does not know the names of. My men will sleep with whores who know exactly how much to charge for a story like this. She looked at him, liking him and already wary of liking him. And you, Marwyn? What do you do when the world behaves? I misbehave, he said, honest as salt. There is a ship I mean to catch when it comes. It will not come for some time. In the meantime, I will look into a candle and see if anything looks back. Do not let it fall in love with you, she said. Too late, he said cheerfully. Or too early. It is difficult to know beginnings. Easier to know ends. Oh, ends are a form of cowardice, she said. Only men who do not have work to do talk about endings. Help me to the 6th bell. After that, we shall see. When the 6th bell rang, Oldtown had made itself as beautiful as a woman whose husband has just returned from a voyage with gifts. The light and the air had the familiar gold dust of late afternoon over water. Men had put away things they could not defend and set out things they could pretend never to have owned. Dogs had learned which corners would be kicked today and which would not. Women had measured cold stew and hot bread and decided how much to give to whom for what. The Hightower's causeway became a place where the city could look at itself like a mirror. Yara stood there with her men behind her like a cliff with gulls. Across, a cluster of men in green and white came and arranged themselves in the way men do, when they must look grand at a distance, and cannot afford to show that some of them have rashes under their mail. Baylor came after, not too quickly. His face wore its hair like an apology for the lack of wit beneath it, as she remembered. He had the air of a man who had been told 3 stories that day and could not decide which to believe. Beside him, an older man with a clean jaw and steady eyes, and a girl, slender, with hair wind-fussed and eyes that had learned too young to look down from height. Melora, the Hightower's daughter who read in the tower with her father, if stories were to be believed. Yara watched her and allowed herself the smallest shiver of interest. A girl who loved books as men love knives was a thing worth knowing. You have injured my men, Baylor said, and then, as if a tutor had kicked him in the ankle, added, and my city. Your men tried to do their work, Yara said. They did it poorly. I have taught them to do it differently. Your city has a new story to tell. It is a small injury for a story. Baylor frowned the way men frown when a woman has answered them with a thing not easily being answered back. The older man beside him, his uncle or a captain, she could not tell. Oldtown loved uncles. Leaned and said something behind his hand. Baylor nodded because advice has a taste like milk to men who are not yet 30. You will leave, he said, but it had less water behind it than the captain's version at noon had. I will go when I am finished, Yara said. Tomorrow, or the next day. I have messages to send and promises to hear. You will keep your boats where they are tonight. If you send one beyond the bend in the river, my men will burn 2 of yours and return one with a hole in its side and say they are sorry. You will not light your beacon with steadiness until morning. If you do, we will raise 3 sails and lower 3 others, and your pilots will think the wind has changed, and 2 of your fattest galleys will fetch up on the bar. Threats, Baylor said, on the edge of a sulk. Certainties, Yara said, gentle as milk. You will send to me a man who knows your accounts. I will speak to him about the harbor fees. They will be altered for a time. My ships will pass for less coin than they should. I will pay more in a year. You will be proud of your cleverness then, and will be watching another woman. Do not make me teach you the lesson now, instead of later. He stood there long enough to demonstrate to all the onlookers that he could stand there if he chose. Then he glanced aside, and the older man beside him moved forward an inch, and the girl beside him did not move at all. Yara met the girl's eyes for the length of one long inhale. Melora Hightowers looked back with an interest that was not fear and not desire, and therefore would be the most dangerous of all if Yara let it. She smiled as she smiled at dangerous things and dipped her chin a fraction. The girl did not smile. She nodded in the tiniest way and let her eyes rest on the iron ring of keys at Yara's belt, and then on the boy at the prow of the Black Wind who held his rope like a duty, and then on the candle in her thoughts because Yara saw her see it, impossibly, and understood that stories in Oldtown had a way of becoming not stories more often than elsewhere. Tomorrow, Yara said, and the city took the word and repeated it in 20 kitchens and 200 beds and 100 little books where men wrote things to themselves they could tell no one. She turned then and let the evening take her back across the causeway and down into the smell of the river, and she knew that Oldtown had not been captured in the way Victorian would have liked it captured, with smoke and screaming and women with hair torn and men with heads split. It had been captured like a ship in a slow tide, by being told that the tide was a story and that no one could be blamed for a story's ending, when the story had been written this way long ago. On the Black Wind, Wren had found a place to stand where he could be neither in the way nor invisible. He looked at her when she came aboard, not with gratitude, which she would have distrusted, and not with despair, which she would have discarded, but with the steady, slow hunger of a man who already had begun to love the sea, because it neither lied nor promised. She put a hand on his shoulder for the length of one beat of the Hightower's sloppy beacon. Then she took it away and did not look back at the tower, because the candle was in her thoughts, and a girl who read in high places was in her thoughts, and so was a city that had accepted a new word into its vocabulary and was trying the taste of it in its mouth. Tonight, she would sleep ashore in a house with a clean floor and a bed that had known a marriage. She would drink wine and spit it into the hearth if it was bad. She would listen at a window to how the city told its own story about her. In the morning, the work would begin again, not with blood, but with numbers. She was ironborn. Men would never forgive her for choosing sums. She smiled without teeth, and felt the ship take the river under her, as if the honey wine had been waiting for her all this time, and was only now at last pleased to admit it. The house they found for her was new to pretending it had a master. It had been built 30 years ago by a man who sold candles and bought himself the sort of bed a woman could be proud to turn down if she wanted to be cruel and proud to accept if she wanted to be kind. The window opened on the bend of the honey wine where dusk went to drink before it decided to be night. There was a bowl with cherries on the table because someone thought the presence of fruit made a house a home. The cherries were a day past perfect and tasted like a season running a small fever. Yara sat with her boots off and her knife on the table within the reach of her left hand, because reach matters more than right or left when sleep is a guest you cannot trust. She let the papery voice of the city fill the room. Crockery making a point in another house. Laughter under a window where a thoughtless boy had noticed a thoughtful girl. The long, thin simmer of a kettle that was not yet needed. A dog arguing with a boat's wake for the pleasure of hearing its own bark come back off stone. Torvald stood with his shoulder to the lintel, tired and upright and stubborn. In a place where men had learned to bow as easily as to breathe, he looked like the one short wall in a room otherwise given over to screens and curtains. "You could take the Hightower," he said without saying "I want it," because he had learned to separate desire from counsel. "Stone by stone if you had to." "I could," Yara said, and bit into a cherry, and tasted the day's sweetness failing. "And then I would have to hold it, stone by stone, day by day. You can take a thing with one kind of strength and only keep it with another. The second kind costs more." He grunted, not because he disagreed, but because he liked the sound of a grunt better when a woman was right. He had never liked the starry sept bells when he had heard them at sea. They carried too far, and told the water things it did not want to hear. Now when they told Vesper, he listened with his head on one side, as if to a gull that might sing a secret if coaxed. Yara laced her fingers behind her head, and thought of the sept as a kind of ship built to keep men from thinking they stood on their own feet. The gods had oarsmen and sails as surely as she did. They took oaths as she did, oaths to wind, to wait, to a code written on a tide line. "You'll go?" Torvald asked. "I said I would stand on the steps and give the gods a chance to be wise." She said, "I keep promises even to stone." The steps of the starry sept held the day after the day had left. A skein of warmth lay along the stone like the hand of an old priest, who had blessed too many heads and forgotten most of them. Men and women moved around each other the way they do in places where habit has trained them to share a god without sharing each other's business. Eyes down, eyes up. A nod here, a look away there. Coin cupped, not with shame and not with pride. A septon with a good gray beard that had been washed that afternoon took one pace forward when Yara came up from the street, and his hands had the beginnings of a tremor that spoke of age and of having seen too much. "You are not welcome here," he said, but he said it with the softness of a man telling a stray that the house already has enough cats. "I do not require welcome to see a door," Yara said. "I require a place to stand. Stone gives it. Your gods can share." He looked at her lips and her boots and the knife as an old man counts the cost of bread. "You have brought blood into the city. Do you mean to bring it into the sept?" "I have brought mercy into the city as well," she said, and tossed the little leather coin bag she had filled with the small money of any port. 100 small alms, each the size of a baker's shrug, so that it landed in his palm. He did well not to flinch. "Spend it on those who cannot pay for their candles tonight. Tell them the sea yielded it. They will like that story better than the other." He did not thank her. He weighed the bag and then put it in his sleeve and made the sign of the 7 with a care that had less to do with piety than with the memory in his joints. "The gods will judge you," he said. "They will do it by what I keep and what I throw away," she said, and went up 2 steps and no more, and stood in a place where you could see the Hightower's pale length and the black base that made men feel small, even when they tried not to, and the bald-dumbed reach of the Citadel huddling to one side like a thinking animal. She did not pray. She looked at the city and told herself how it was layered. Wine on coin, on fear, on habit, on pride, on story. If you cut it at the wrong angle, you would get only scars. If you cut it right, you might see rings and count years. She stood long enough to satisfy the gods of patience, whose altars are never fashionable and whose worshippers do not talk about their worship. On the way back, she let herself be lost and then let herself be found, because a city that cannot lose you is a city you cannot use. She saw boys sleeping under carts with one shoe on because it gave them a reason to wake and feel something that had not been stolen. She saw a woman carrying a hod of bricks up a 3-story stair and wanted to put her shoulder under the weight and did not. She smelled onion and bladder and river and something sweet that was not honey. A pastry pressed into oil by the careful palm of a woman who had decided that despair was a luxury and could be traded for profit. She came back to the candle house when the first stars were trying their names on the sky. Marwan had not moved from himself and had moved from the chair. He carried an air of inward travel, the way a good pilot carries the shore inside his skull. The candle lay hooded. Its hood was a silken length of darkness that made the room feel like a throat closing. Peristan dozed upright with his chain slipping sideways and cutting his collarbone. Ren stood at a table with a book open, as if it were a patient, and his hands the knives that mattered. "Do not fall in love with it," Yara told the boy without edge, and he looked up with the same expression he had worn on the deck. "That's slow hunger. It will not fall in love with you. Books make bad wives." "I thought they made better ones," he said, surprising both of them by daring the jest. "They make patient ones," she said. "Patient and implacable. If you leave them, they do not come after you. When you come back, they remember where you were wrong." "Then so." Marwyn flicked the hood with 2 fingers, and the candle woke the way a lake wakes when a fish turns itself over under the surface. Not with light, but with a decided change in the quality of looking. "One more," he said. "Then you will let me be selfish and see my own business." "What door?" Yara asked. "Not a door," he said. "A window. You must know whether your shadow stretches farther than you think. It is a protection against stepping on your own toes in the dark." Meant so. She thought of Euron, and then did not, because to think of him while looking into a thing that answered thoughts was to invite him into the room. She thought instead of the Shield Islands, which had learned to call themselves a wall and to believe it. She thought of the Pilots' Guild and their ledger. She thought of Baelor's second son again, and let herself want to see him messily drunk in a room where someone else would have to clean up his wine. She did not get any of it. The candle made a different decision than hers. It showed her a piece of black water with stars written on it, as if for a moment, the sky had decided to swim and let the sea have the writing. A sail crossed those stars, and was not a sail she knew. The cut was wrong. The stitching had a slant used by men who had learned to make canvas with the care of a barber. The feeling that came with the sight was old. The way a storm beyond the horizon feels in the belly before it makes itself visible. "Enough," she said, and Marwyn let the hood fall, and the room went back to being a place where men's breath and men's eyes were the only measures. He smiled his little inward smile, and she did not ask what his business was, because men like him spent their lives hiding it, and lived longer for having done so. They came for her in the night, because stories about Ironborn always end with fire and men in nightshirts, and narrow streets, and someone screaming, and someone on a balcony, saying which god will forgive this. It is always either night or dawn. In Oldtown, it was night. 4 men in green thought to take her in her sleep and found Torwald awake and uninterested. The first lost his balance on a cherry he trod on in the dark, and died with the smell of fruit in his nose. The second learned that a man who has been taking doors with his shoulder since he was 12 can put you through a wall as if you were chalk, and the wall only drew on you. The third tried to be clever and came at Yara from under the bed, and found that knife and foot and bed leg is a bad trinity to be caught between. The fourth ran and died. There are always 4. There are always 3 dead, and 1 who runs to tell the story wrong, and thus tell it usefully. In the morning, Yara stood in the same place on the causeway where she had stood the day before, and watched the river show her its standard moods: fat, sly, disinterested, in love with its own surface. The men in green did not come. The city sent something better: women. They came 2 and 3 at a time, and then 4 together, and then a single old woman, with a scar above one eye, that said she had once loved a man who'd believed a horse could be made to understand a wall. They did what women do in cities when war has passed the door, but not yet climbed the stairs. They critiqued it. They looked at the way Ironborn had tied ropes, and muttered to themselves about the knots. They sniffed at the river and made a face about the offal floating downstream from the butcher beyond the bridge, and said he had been warned and did not learn, and therefore would envy those who died of natural causes, because his wife would kill him sooner or later for shame. They counted Yara's men without counting them, and calculated which would break if a hand pushed here, and which would simply take the hand with them if you pushed at all. They decided what to tell their men later, and how not to tell it in a way that made their men brave in ways that kept bread coming. "You are their wife now," Torwald said, half a smile making his beard ridiculous and more human. "All these wives, they will tell you how you can improve. They are the best captains in any harbor," Yara said. "Every man who knows what a rope weighs when wet had a woman teach him not to wrap it around his throat. At noon, the pilot sent a man with a book that did not look like a book until you opened it, and found the corners of charts folded cunning as a tailor's secrets. He was Grig after all. She could smell pride and salt in the same measure as she had felt in the candle's false light the day before. He had a wife with a black scarf, and a daughter with a braid that would be unwound by a boy honest enough to be clumsy. He did not like her and admired her. He had the narrow eyes of a man who has made a living telling his fear to wait on the steps like a patient dog. What does a tide book cost when you must eat and must not drown? She asked. A man's time, which is a woman's time, which is dear, he said. And a little blood, because you cannot make a page that matters without a cut somewhere on the hand that made it. She put her fingers on the book briefly. I will pay you for the blood, not the hours, she said. The hours are your pride. If I pay for them, you will feel bought. Menso. Sea woman, he said. And that was either an insult or a compliment in Oldtown's mouth. And both tasted much the same when you swallowed. You will come to the guild hall and say that in a room where men who never go out in fog pretend to own it. Send me an hour, she said. Not sooner. He went away because he had other hours to sell, and she did the thing no tale of Ironborn would have her do. She sent 3 men with small coins in their hands to pay women where men had taken things. They paid the woman with the bakery for the bread that disappeared from her cooling board at dawn. They paid the woman with the meat stall for fat and bone and gossip. They paid the old man with the wrinkled ear who kept the little skiff under the bridge and pretended not to rent it to boys to kiss in, because he wanted him as an ally more than an enemy, and because a boat under a bridge knows a city's moods better than any tower does. The conclave met because empires are made of tables, and men around them, as surely as they are made of walls and men on them. Peristan came late and sat carefully, because he had all night learned how to be a man who does not break when he leans to one side. Abros, who liked to make students laugh in order to make them remember, did not laugh once, and thereby made all the boys in gray around the wall correct their posture. Ellen, who thought sex and knowledge were cousins, smiled because a woman had put her boots on their book, metaphorically, and he liked metaphor when it had its foot on his throat. 8 other men spoke in the tones of men who believe that if they say a thing with enough patience, the world will decide it is true. You have invited pirates into our house, one said. I have invited the sea, Marwan said. This is a river city. It is good to remember that water does not end where you think. Words, said another, contempt like salt. We will send for Highgarden. Send for whom you like, Peristan said in a voice that had discovered in itself a low stone and sat down on it. They will arrive when they can. In the meantime, I advise we not lose what is here for what might come. He surprised himself saying it and did not look at Marwan because if he did, he would see satisfaction, and that would make him angry. They wrote a letter to Highgarden that said less than it seemed to say and more than they intended. They sent a bird to the red wines that said everything and nothing as all good trade letters do. They sent a boy to the pilots to ask whether the chain would hold under stress, and the boy came back with the look of a boy who had been told to go home and do sums until he could count his fingers without help. They made a plan to preserve the books near the black door if fire came, because fire is the god not even gods like to argue with. They decided nothing. They never decide. They accrete. The Citadel survives by sediment. In the afternoon, a man came up the causeway with a clean jaw and a white scar like a crescent over the eye, to say the Hightowers would meet before dusk, if the river would kindly keep its temper. He announced himself as Sir, which in Oldtown is both a promise and a prayer. Yara nodded because a nod costs less than a word, and because silence keeps lords from believing you have given something away. She sent him back with a little written thing in a clerk's hand that said we will meet, and wrote it in their cipher, because it pleased her to use their little game to tell them something ordinary. On the river, a boat caught because a barrel slipped, and its rope took a man around the chest, and made him a fish, and the boat made a decision to love the river more than the men in it. The men on the bank shouted helpful things that were not helpful. The boy salmon at the beacon, who had done as she told him and lied well, and been proud in a way that terrified him. Saw it from high and had the moment boys have. If I do nothing, it will be only a story. If I do something, it will be a different story. But I may die. He ran down 40 steps and then 80 and 100 and came out onto the platform where Yara could see him, and Torvald put his hand hard around the rope at his waist, because boys are the worst cowards when they are brave. They took one more rope and a hook and a woman's shawl found on a railing, and they made a kind of cradle, not perfect and not elegant and exactly enough. The man on the rope coughed a pint of water on the bank and said a woman's name the way men say gods in a storm. The boy looked at Yara because boys who have done something that hurt them want to be told if it was a virtue. She did not clap. She did not say brave. She said, "You lied well this morning. Keep lying. It will keep more men alive than heroics." His face did something complicated and good. He went back up the steps because some boys love orders more than praise, and she was in the habit of letting them. Ren learned knots and the names of the winds the way a boy learns a woman's moods who has lived too long with a mother who was fair and sometimes cruel. He cursed impressively when rope burned his palm. He did not weep. He wrote tide times in a hand that was neat and discovered that neatness fails at sea and had to learn to write ugly and true. Torvald set him to splicing 2 lengths of old rope until the splice had the smoothness of a lie. A lord tells his wife, and both of them know it is a lie, and both accept it for what it saves. Yara showed him how to read the lick of wind on water where the current bunched, and how to tell what came in the wake of a thing he could not see. At dusk, she took him to the little low room behind the ravenry and showed him how men had built a clever pulley so that boys could hoist the heavy beak of the trap when they had to bring many birds to the window and had no men to help. He looked at the pulley with the same slow hunger. "I could make a better one," he said. "If I had a better rope." "You could," she said, and let him have the thought, because the world needs boys who think they can improve pulleys more than it needs men who think they can improve women. Melora came when the day laid its head down. She came without attendants, or with attendants who knew how to be air. She had the look of a girl who had always been taller than her brothers, until suddenly she was not, and had had to learn that the feeling of height stays in the spine, even when it leaves the eyes. She wore gray that made men look past her in a room, and then look back because the mind does not love being fooled by its own laziness. She smelled like books and some sharp thing not made to be perfume, an herb that keeps moths out of page edges. Her eyes had the habit of people who have peered at maps and then looked out a window to see whether the world had obeyed the map. "You have stolen from my city," she said with the air of starting on page 5 of a book you both have read. "I have taken," Yara said. "Your city has a long history of putting what it took into charters and letters and calling it law." "They were men," Melora said irrelevantly, as if she had noticed it anew this morning and found it dull. "You speak of a candle. You do not fear it." "I fear many things," Yara said. "I fear tides that come wrong. I fear a rope that seems whole and is rotten inside in a way a woman's hand knows but a man's eye misses. I fear men who laugh too quickly when blood is a step away. I do not fear this candle because I can leave this room, and it cannot. If it learns to climb stairs, I will begin to be impressed, and then I will run." "Now." Melora's mouth did not smile. Her eyes learned something. "My father looks into glass," she said. "He thinks it tells him secrets other men do not deserve. I think it tells him stories he wants to hear because they are the kinds of stories men build towers for. He believes himself a man outside time. I have read enough books to know no one is outside time. Not even stories. Not even the sea. Now." "Good," Yara said. "You will marry a man who does not bore you." "I will not marry," Melora said. "That is the only thing worth reading the right books to know." She put her hand, long-fingered, on the candle's table, not to test heat, but to test her own boldness. Marwyn watched her with the admiration a rogue priest gives a heretic who has a better liturgy than his own. "If I were to ask for something," she said, What would it cost? It depends what you ask, Yara said. If you ask for the names of the boys I will steal, it will cost you your pride. If you ask for a map of the currents under the whispering sound not written by your men, it will cost you the story you tell yourself when you look from the top of the tower at the little moving things below. If you ask for my knife, it will cost you your breath for 3 heartbeats, while I decide whether you are trying to be brave or merely impudent. Then? Melora nodded, as if she had found the page she had hoped would be there. I want the list of pilots, she said. The old one. The one of those who owe the Citadel more than the Citadel has ever written down. Yara lifted a brow and waited. My father thinks swords are useful, Melora said. I think men who know where the shoals are at midnight are more useful. I will trade. What? What? I will give you the tides under the tower, Melora said. The old ones. The ones we do not publish because we prefer to have men feel they must rely on us. The tides under the tower are stone, Yara said. They move only when something breaks. Stone moves, Melora said. Even gods move. Even the high tower. A piece fell last winter, and men pretended it was an illusion because it had never happened in their lifetime. Yara weighed the 2 kinds of knowledge the way she weighed a net. How many fish, how many holes, how many knots that would need to be retied once they had stretched under weight. Done, she said. I will not give you all the names. I will give you enough that you become a person men tell the truth to when they think it helps them. Melora inclined her head. It was not gratitude. It was a gambler palpably enjoying the moment, when the card is lifted, and the heart knows whether it has been wise or doom. You will not stay, she said. No. You could, Melora said. You could lay a chain across this river of your own, a chain of light rather than iron. I prefer water to light, Yara said. Light turns. Water takes. If I lay a chain of any kind, it will be a chain of promises, and those break faster than iron. Sometimes promises hold a city better than walls, Melora said with an almost smile. Men do not like to admit it. Women do. Good night, sea woman. Yara watched her go, and was pleased more than she should have been that the girl did not trip on her own cleverness as clever girls do when they hurry. At the 6th bell, she met Baylor again on the causeway where all things in Oldtown seemed to come to be measured. The day had been the sort that makes men decide to live. Warm but not arrogant. Generous without spectacle. A wind that punished no one. The high tower's white length was smug in such a light. Men in green stood behind Baylor like the arguments he had time for, and behind them stood men without livery like the arguments he did not, and could not afford to hear now. We will not have you set our fees, Baylor said, as if that were the thing. You will have me do it for you, and then you will pretend you chose it, Yara said. The difference will be in which of us women in the market smile at. He took a long breath and discovered what command is for boys. Learning to make phrases that move coin without looking at coin. We will pay less for your ships, he said. Other ships will pay a little more. It will not be called tax. It will be called correction. He looked proud of the word, and then ashamed, and then a little hungry to be thought clever. You will let my ships pass at night, Yara said. When fog lies, you will say the pilots asked for it, and that the Citadel recommended it, because weather is an education as much as a phenomenon. You will not send for the red wines for a week. You will tell the Tyrells that a dispute about barrel sizes, and here she thought of the lie she had told as a courtesy to the morning, and marveled at how quickly lies can become laws, requires their notice, and that they should not send men until you know whether men will be offended. You speak as if we served you, Baylor said, half trying to find insult, half trying to sound brave before the men who polished his pins. You serve the river and the wind, Yara said. You serve coin when you say you serve honor. I will not accuse you of a crime you cannot stop committing. She put her foot up on the low rail of the causeway and looked at the black base of the tower and thought, as she always did when she saw anything so large, of rope and lever, of how you could move things men told. You cannot be moved. You will send a maester to me when a certain kind of letter arrives, she said. You will not read it first. You will not admit it came. If you do, I will know. I will know because the letter will tell me. Ben? He frowned because that sounded like magic, and he did not like magic, because the tower disliked things that did not belong to it. What letter? The kind with too much wax and not enough love, she said, and let him puzzle over that while she allowed herself to enjoy how men with power hate not understanding. They agreed to a dozen other things that were promises in everything but spelling. He promised to hang 2 boys, and she made him see that 2 boys killed makes 4 more braver than they should be. So he agreed to lock them in a shed where their fathers could come plead and be humiliated by their women later, and the lesson would go deeper. She promised to take nothing from a certain street that belonged to a certain guild, and he promised to make that guild cut its own throat quietly by raising prices and calling it salvation. He asked a question about ironborn gods and she said nothing, and let the river say it for her, by pushing at the causeway piles with a weight that could be felt in the arches of the feet. In the end, he left with the serious look of a man who thinks he has earned a drink, and she remained with the serious look of a woman who knows she has earned another day. Night brought a wind from the west, and with it, a smell of cut grass and manure from the fields beyond where the city ended, and pretended it did not. The beacon finally decided to be itself. Its light described the sea, with a surety that made pilots stand on their toes and feel tall. Salmon slept with one hand under his cheek and his mouth open, because boys always do. A man came across the causeway light-footed, with a knife in his belt, and in his air, the sense that he had been told this job would impress someone. He did not see a Laris, the Sphinx to boys who have never been south of the Mander, and think nickname is identity. Sitting quiet under a shadow with a bow as casual across the knees as a lover across thighs. The arrow took the man in the thigh where the artery lies, and he learned quickly that a leg can empty a life as quickly as a throat. Elorus said nothing. Elorus did not look at Yara, except to nod once, when a nod would prevent a needless question. Marin students were useful because they had learned the economy of gesture. In the small hours, Yara made herself go alone to the black door again. She liked being a woman whose men could not imagine alone was a thing she did because they had learned never to leave a ship's master without ears around her. Tonight she required none. The candle was hooded. She did not lift the hood. She put her hand flat on the table and felt the room in her palm. The tiny ridges of grain turned slow as a century. The imprint of a jar that had sat there for years and been moved a finger's breadth to the left, and the wood still remembered. The slight grit of dust on the cloth in a city where dust has manners. Peristan had fallen asleep in a chair again, and his chain lay like a stolen river across his chest. He was a man who had been placed too high for his comfort by a world that decided one day it needed a particular voice and found his. She stood there until the ache in her legs brought her back to herself, and then she went out into the hall that smelled of oil and men's hair, and the sort of bread you bake when you are too tired to be kind to it. She found the door to the roof and climbed the last 20 steps, because roofs tell you the truth about cities that rooms never do. Oldtown lay under her like a map that had been corrected by a dozen hands and was still wrong in 6 places. She felt affection for it she would never admit. From here, the river looked like a law rather than a persuasion, and the high tower looked like a decision made long ago that had yet to be rescinded. She hummed once, the first music she had allowed herself in 2 days, because the air required something human in it, or it would begin to talk of its own importance. At dawn, the air was so clean she could taste tin in it, like a blade held too long between teeth. The pilot's hall smelled of onions and work. Greg had waited, as he said he would, which meant he had told himself a story about duty, and found it better than the story about fear. He introduced her to a woman with forearms like rolled wool, who had kept 3 men from drowning by telling them to shut up in the right tone. Her name was Isolde, and she had a voice that had worn through a dozen men's patience and found a way to the other side, where usefulness lies. She spoke of bars and bends and whirls of water with the intimacy other women reserve for the names of their lovers' flaws. This here, she said, drawing a finger on the chart where the honey wine met the sound, is where men who pretend to be pilots die. The sand shifts. The sea lies. The birds tell you truths you wish you hadn't asked for. A man who keeps his mouth closed and his head low loves this place longer. Mendermauer. Yara listened. She put her finger down and moved it a finger's breadth, and Isolde nodded once the way craftspeople nod when they meet a woman whose hands know what they touch. If you had had this 10 years ago, Isolde said, not looking up from the chart, you could have taken 3 red wine ships without sweating. Now? Now you can take 5 without being greedy. I do not want ships, Yara said. Isolde looked up slowly because hearing a sea woman say it is like hearing a septon say he does not want to be buried. What do you want then? Time, Yara said. Time in which men will act in a certain way because they believe they have not been forced to. Time to put a thing in place that will keep other things from breaking when the sea's mood turns. Isolde grunted once, which in her mouth meant I have heard a new word for an old thing. You have the money. I have coin and hunger both, Yara said. I will spend the coin. I will not spend the hunger. She paid for the chart, and for the margins, and for the insult that came with taking work from men's hands. She paid for 3 boys to learn the river in a boat with an ironborn at the stern, so that someday when a man in green told them to turn left, they would know when to nod and when to keep straight because of the way the water trembled under the hull. By noon the agreement that was not an agreement had been spoken often enough that it held. The Hightower's men had been told at their tables what honor demanded and what their wives would put up with. The Seps had received coin and murmured the words that make pain less of an appetite. The Citadel had moved its worst enemies to upper shelves and its best friends to lower shelves. The pilots had charged a kingly rate for taking 2 of Yara's longships up a narrow gut at a turn of the tide that makes even brave men bite their tongues. Then they had done it and impressed themselves. The black wind had taken on water with a slowness that meant the river did not intend malice today. Ren had a blister that made him swear and then laugh because he had earned it with something other than being afraid in a library. Salmon slept twice and woke both times with a thought already in his mouth. That evening Melora sent a folded thing in a hand small and precise. It came with a boy who did not speak because he had been told not to, and because he liked being told not to speak a little too much. The paper showed the under eddies at the base of the Hightower, drawn in a careful ink that gave water something almost mechanical, as if it were a contrivance rather than a personality. It listed the times when the river bit at the stones, and the times when it licked. It made a note in a neat margin like Peristan's clerk. If you drop a heavy thing here, it will fetch up there. If you pour oil here, it will get under the scum and make men think the wind has turned. It smelled like a girl's pride who has been allowed to make a man's decision. Yara tucked it into her belt and did not show it to Torvald because he would tilt his head and end by loving Melora for it, and Yara was not prepared to share that. Night brought a lesser trouble. A group of men from the Barrelmaker Street came with cudgels to prove that men with tools can be soldiers when beer tells them so. They met a rope strung knee-high across a dark mouth of an alley and learned together what falling feels like when done as a chorus. They went away with bruises and a story they would tell as victory, and thereby make other men brave enough to do the same stupid thing in daylight. Yara did not laugh at them. She had been young enough to call stubbornness courage, and old enough to know that sometimes it is enough. On the 3rd morning, the red wine birds began to return answers. Their letters had the careful gentility of men who know they are rich, and that their richness came from a woman who was not their wife and not their mother. The sea. They apologized for wind. They apologized for rumor. They announced prices with a modesty that was neither modest nor theirs. They asked whether barrels would be required to be of the size argued in the Guildhall, and whether that matter had been decided, and whether the Citadel had an opinion that might be quoted when the matter came up in another hall in another city. Yara answered with Peristan's hand, which trembled less when he thought in tidy paragraphs. She let him write gentlemen, and regrettably, and in due course. Then she added a line in the Ironborn manner. The wine will move faster if you let it, and men will drink it and tell other men that they did so in spite of their fear. The red wine's like men who drink in spite of fear. It makes them noble. She took time for the only thing that makes time expand rather than shrink: teaching. She showed Ren the little trick of the river at the bend. where a fallen willow had long ago taught water to make a pattern it had not learned elsewhere. She showed Salmon, in a spare minute at the beacon, the difference between moving a wheel, because it is time, and moving it, because the air calls for it. She sat with Isolde for 10 breaths, and listened to the language a woman's hands make on a steering oar, when the tide is lying and the wind is guessing. She told Torvald a story about her mother's knife he had heard, and loved twice and asked to hear again, because the only way to make men accept sums is to feed them story with it. On the 4th day, the conclave made a small brave decision that felt to them like a large one. They gave Yara a key of her own to one door that men with chains had always had to open. It was a simple iron with a nick mare's breath halfway down the shaft. They did it because she had already taken all the other keys she needed. They did it to preserve their own habit of being the ones who hand a thing to the world, even when the world already holds it. She took it with a nod. The nod anything a woman can give a man that lets him keep his face. The same day, Baylor's second son did the stupid thing she had expected, and went out drunk with 3 friends, and decided to show courage near Ironborn. He came into the pilot's quarter, and called a woman a name men learn when they are 14, and forget only when they are hungry. He bared his teeth. He drew his knife and opened it, and closed it again twice, because men like that fall in love with the sound. Alaras, who had been leaning in a doorway because the day was warm, and there is no reason a bow cannot belong in a warm doorway, did nothing. Torvald did the thing Yara loved him for. He hit the boy once. He hit him once in a way that told a body its story, without either breaking it or letting it go unshamed. The boy fell like a little tower. His friends stood around him like carved saints, who had chosen bad positions in a church. Yara took the boy's knife. She handed it to his friend. "If you like the sound," she said, "play safe with it. Not in the street. The street does not forgive illusions." The boy woke with a hurt pride that would make him twice the enemy or half. It is difficult to say with boys. Melora would hear of it and either laugh or not. Yara did not care. She had given the city another story to tell itself at supper. It could have ended there because stories like to end at a negotiated place. It did not. Stories that have glass in them prefer other shapes. 2 nights after the boy fell, Marwyn came to Yara with a look in his face that meant the candle had not just answered him but had asked a question back. He held his hand still as men do when something inside them vibrates. "Ships," he said softly, "from the north and east. From a mind like a black sail. Not to Oldtown yet, but a mind that likes places with towers. Euron," she said before she could stop herself, and the room learned a different taste. Torwald's jaw made a little click. Peristan looked at his hands. Ren did not know the name enough to fear it properly, and looked pleased, and then ashamed of being pleased, because he had been wise for 3 days, and did not want to undo it. "How many?" "Enough to make a song," Marwyn said. "Which in a city like this means too many for comfort, and just enough to be worth seeing. The candle shows you the face that wants to be looked at." A crow looked back at me. Not a raven. A crow. It smiled with a man's mouth. "He will not come to Oldtown if I am here," Yara said, and knew she may have just told herself the lie she warned men not to fall in love with. "He likes to take what other men think they hold. He does not like sharing." "Then you will not be here," Marwyn said with a cheerfulness that was either courage or opportunism, and is often both. "You will have what you came for. Knowledge. Keys. Boys with quick hands and the memory of knots. Treaties that are not treaties. You will be elsewhere making use of it. The city will stand and fall and stand. It always does. I will be gone as well. There is a ship I mean to take." Yara looked at the candle and then at the river. "I will leave men," she said. "Not many. Enough to keep the pilots honest. Enough to keep Peristan from being brave at the wrong hour. Enough to keep Baylor from thinking he can pay back his humiliation in coin made of other men's blood." "Then Swas." Torvald nodded, as if this had been decided the night they set out. Ren's mouth opened to ask whether he was one of the men left, and then he closed it because he had learned in 4 days more sense than the Citadel gives some men in 4 years. Salmon slept with his head in his arms, because boys in towers do not dream of ships until later, and then they never stop. On the 5th morning, Yara went to the conclave, and put her palm on the table where men had put theirs for centuries, and felt, in the wood, the weight of those hands. "I will go," she said. "Your city will breathe again. It will tell itself that it was invaded, and it survived, and it forgave, and it befriended. It will adjust its tariffs and pretend it is law. You will add a footnote to a book, and one day an apprentice will read it and think it happened to someone else in a time when men were different." Then the island. Peristan swallowed a noise and then made another. Something like gratitude. Something like a prayer. Abros smiled, once, which meant relief. Valen sighed as if he had been denied a wicked amusement he had promised himself. Marwyn did not stand because he did not stand for men who said sensible things. He sat and held his hands as if a small bird trembled in them and would fly or die based on whether he made a fist. "You have done what you said," he said. "It is more than most kings do." "I am not a king," Yara said. "Kings are for men who need a shape for their fear." She went into the ravenry the last time and stood where the black tide of feather and sound had washed around her days ago, and told the boys to bring forward 2 birds with white flecks at the throat and 1 with a scar on its leg. She wrote 3 messages. 1 to a pilot in the Shields who had almost drowned her twice and taught her more than he intended. 1 to a woman in a cove north of Highgarden who sewed and made rope and understood both. 1 to a house on the arbor where a man kept a barrel imperfectly on purpose because he loved imperfection better than profit. She told them in different words the same thing. "Be ready to act as if you had chosen what you will do when I ask." The birds went into the light with the same obedience with which men go to their work. At the causeway Baylor came a last time, because face is a kind of coin, and he had learned not to let it pass out of his hands too often. Melora did not come. Yara was glad and not glad. She had liked the girl too quickly for comfort. The girl had liked the candle too quickly for Yara to trust her. They had done what dangerous women do when they meet. They had traded a thing less than a secret and more than a courtesy. It would be enough for now. "We will remember this," Baylor said in a tone men use when they threaten promises. "You will forget it," Yara said. "Until the next time." That is how cities live. They forget in order to live with themselves. Then he blew out a breath and made the little gesture boys make when they have been outmaneuvered and are old enough to admire it. "Come back," he said, "when you want something else. I will send a boy," she said, and found that the sentence made her feel, for one alarming heartbeat, something like tenderness. She stepped down into the black wind's belly and felt the ship know her weight, know her wishes, know which way to lean. Ren took his place at the bow with his rope and his pride. Torwald planted his feet. Karen canted the sail without flourish and made the river do as they asked, because the river sometimes gives you that pleasure. Salmon, high above, leaned on a parapet and did something Yara could not see with the wheel, and learned in his chest a little of what it is to command without being a commander. Oldtown receded the way lovers do in doorways, too slowly, and then all at once. The high tower's beam drew a long line across water and cut. The Citadel's low back looked like an animal sniffing after a scent it could not name. The starry sept had the patience of stone. Women washed steps, indifferent to the drama, and absorbed in the daily theater that never stops. Men unloaded barrels. A boy ran with a message and discovered an adult step was longer than he had thought, and nearly fell and did not. Yara let her eye hold all of it and then let it go. They cleared the chain where the chain would have been raised if morning had been less pliable. Down channel, the sound opened like a throat into the mouth of the world. The air changed because you build cities in one kind of air and live on water in another. The boats that had come to test them fell away with the good sense that sometimes grips even brave men. A dolphin rolled once with insolent indifference. The sky had a line in it, like a scar that meant weather might be a problem if a man were foolish. Yara smiled to herself and looked at the chart Isolde had mended and the notes in the margin a clerk had made with a personality bolder than his pen, and the delicate little drawing Melora had made of the eddies at the tower's base and the key at her belt that had been given rather than taken, and she weighed them. "We will taste the shields," she said. Then we will taste the arbor. Then we will see whether the sea decides our meal, or we do. Torvald grunted a consent that was as much a blessing as he could give. Ren looked without shame at the horizon as boys do who are still willing to believe that a line is an invitation rather than a warning. The black wind took the sound under her like a promise made without deceit for once. Toward mid-morning they met a red wine cask boat, with polite arrogance painted on its planks, and a man at the stern, with a jaw like a grape. He lifted a hand as lords do when a peasant has not yet bowed. Yara lifted hers in the same shape and robbed the gesture of its inheritance. They passed each other at a distance that promised no accident and guaranteed offense. Behind them, Oldtown's bells took up their duties. Hours, births, a small fire put out by men with buckets and women with curses. Ahead, the sea smelled like iron resting and work beginning. By noon the wind veered. She shortened sail. Torvald cursed mildly because he liked the kind of wind you can bite. Ren's rope slipped and burned him, and he did not swear as impressively as he hoped. A pod of porpoise broke to starboard, and Torvald muttered something to the sea gods about balancing accounts. The sound widened, and then narrowed, like a woman's mind turning on a thought, and deciding it needed sharpening. The men settled into the kind of silence that is not emptiness but capacity. When darkness came again, there was no tower to tell the sea what it should do with light. The stars did what stars do when no one asks them to behave differently. Yara lay with her head against the little combing by the stern post and let the wood tell her where she was in breaths and heartbeats, rather than inches. She closed her eyes for a while and saw a girl in gray looking down at a candle that did not belong to any man and a boy with ink on his fingers, learning how to tie time into rope, and a city that had decided it had survived and that therefore it had been brave and that therefore it would tell that story until someone else came and told a different one. She slept and woke with a song in her mouth and swallowed it because the sea hates songs that brag. Dawn found them where the sound turns less polite. The shields lay on their right hand like four knuckles made by a man who believes fists are for arguing. Beyond them the ocean opened, a conversation without conclusion. Torvald stood with his chin up. "He will come," he said, meaning the mind behind black sails. "He always does," Yara said. "If he does not, he makes someone else think of him twice as much, and that is the same thing." "You think you can beat him with books?" Torvald said in the careful tone that means, "This is not an accusation." "I think I can avoid spending men," Yara said. "I think I can use other men's habits as walls. I think I can steal a tide better than he can steal a heart." Torvald grinned despite himself. "You may be the only Ironborn alive who says heart like a thing you would not die to own." Yara let her gaze rest on the water where the edge of the world seems close because your body cannot believe it goes on. "I will not die for it," she said. "I will kill for it. Those are different things." He nodded as a man nods. When a truth he does not love is still a truth, and there is use in it. The wind stiffened. The black wind leaned into it with animal appetite. Behind them, at their backs like a weight, they had lifted and set into their own ledger. Oldtown learned how it would tell the last 5 days. A brass plate somewhere. A change in the pilot's prayer. A smell women would remember and name and pass to daughters. A small new word in a book that would be read by a boy who would be too much in love with margins and would be saved from it or not. In a tower, a girl in gray set down a quill and looked at her own hands as if they were new. In a low room, a candle burned without flame and without pity, and showed a man a sail with a mind like a crow, and showed him a different thing when he blinked. A woman's foot on a rope, and a boy saying the wrong prayer, and a river being persuaded to do the right thing. Yara stood long enough at the stern to feel the world turn under her with the smallness men hate and the necessity they cannot undo. Then she went forward to the prow because forward is a superstition and a habit and a craft. Ren looked up, not because he needed to, but because a boy's head is a weathercock when a woman he calls captain comes to stand where the world begins. "What do you see?" she asked, and watched his mouth earn an answer. "I see a line," he said, "and that line is not a wall." Good, she said. Now tell me how many breaths until the next wave puts its tongue on the second seam in the bow. He frowned and tried to feel with his feet what she felt in her ribs. He got it wrong. He got it less wrong the next time. He smiled the second time, and did not the third because the sea does not reward pride, and he had begun to understand it. Behind them, a city told itself a story, and in front of them, a man with a crow's mind told himself one. Yara made another, strand by strand. Tide and chart and key and boy and candle and a girl in gray who could not be trusted and must be held in the mind as one holds a blade. By the handle, not by the edge. The black wind cut the sound like a knife used not to kill but to make food, and there was a kind of grace in that which made even Torvald, who loved blood in a decent way, content to watch the light pass from one side of the world to the other without the need to punctuate it with a shout. They saw the first of the shield ships at mid-morning, a bluff-bout thing that had learned to love its own weight. Its captain had the face of a man whose father had told him that duty is a floor and pleasure a rug, and that a man who lies on a rug for too long will forget how to walk. He lifted a hand. Yara lifted hers in the shape the man expected, and then changed it at the last second into another shape. Pilots. No, and soldiers ignore. We want to pass your lee, not your life. He nodded, and found himself pleased to be spoken to in his own language. They slip by with the intimacy big ships share when there is no reason to touch and every reason to feel the other's breath. By noon, the water went a different color because the ocean had forgotten the land's opinions. The wind came round and brought with it a smell of something beyond names, which is always the sea pretending to be a god. Yara laughed once because it was good to be out from under the tower's long finger, even if the candle had given her a way to hold part of it in her hand without being burned. At dusk they hove to in the lee of a low rock as old as chart called a gentleman's lie, a place that looks like shelter until you try to sleep. The swell lifted the black wind in long patient breaths. Men went about small necessary tasks that keep fear from making a fire of a ship. Torvald stood with his forearms on the rail and watched the line where dusk becomes night. Books, he said as if he were chewing a difficult meat and making the best of it. Keys, girls in towers, boys with ropes. You'll beat him with this? I'll beat him by being first at the place he thinks he invented, Yara said. And by not needing to be glorious when being right will do. He laughed, and it was a good sound in that air. That will wound him worse than any axe, he said. To be denied a song. He will write his own, Yara said. He always does. He is good at it. I will make it inconvenient for him to sing it where he likes. Night fell. Stars owned the sky. The black wind swung her head like a mare considering sleep. Yara lay down with her braid under her neck and her knife under her hand, and an entire city in her head, reduced to 4 small things she would not let go of. A key, a page with a thin smear of ink where a girl had blown too hard. The feel of water against a stone not visible from the deck. A boy's deliberate bit lip trying not to smile when a rope at last obeyed him. She carried those things like charms and like tools. She slept the sleep of a woman who has made a city change its story and left it alive to tell it, which is both mercy and arrogance, and woke at first light with the taste of salt on her tongue and work, already crowding past the door of her skull. Morning came on like a promise made between equals. Ahead, the ocean set itself up like a wall out of respect for those who think they need them. She would not take the wall. She would go around it. She had charts for it now. She had boys to teach. She had men to save. She had an enemy who would prefer to be loved and would be forced instead to be outpaced. She had a city behind her that would say her name the way cities do when they want to seem wise and not ashamed. Not too loud, but often. She let herself think, for the span of 3 heartbeats, and no more, of the Hightower's daughter putting her hand on a candle and keeping her face calm. Then she put the thought away as she would a sharp knife halfway into a boot. A comfort, a risk, a promise. We'll make the arbor by moonrise if the wind keeps manners, Torvald said. If it misbehaves, we'll make it anyway and pretend we intended the lesson. Good, Yara said. There's a Cooper there who cheats at dice in a way that makes me admire him. I want him for something honest. He looked at her with a kind of resigned affection men wear. when the woman they follow announces new mathematics. Honest, he said doubtfully. Useful, she said, and grinned like the sea when a ship pretends it has chosen its course. The black wind took the day in her teeth. The sea admitted it had been alone too long. Far behind, in a city that builds towers to talk to itself, a candle that was not a fire burned and did not warm. And the girl in gray looked into it and told herself she was not afraid. Far ahead, somewhere not yet admitted by horizon, a man with a crow's mind counted his sails and put his tongue against his teeth and tasted both iron and story and decided which he loved more. Yara did not pray because she had given the gods their chance, and in any case, prayer is a kind of map, and she had maps enough now to fill her days. She held the rail. She watched the line that is not a wall. She made of knowledge a weapon, and of mercy a rope, and of time the sea it has always been. And she did not waste her breath on songs she could not stomach.